Cressida woke before the sun did. She had done this every day for 3 years, risen in the dark, dressed quietly, walked the cold corridors of the palace before anyone else stirred. Not because she could not sleep, because the palace felt different in those hours, softer, like it was willing to forget, for a little while, that it did not want her there. She was the Luna Queen of Astharoon. She was also, somehow, its best-kept secret. The kingdom was vast and old and proud, the kind of place where bloodlines were discussed the way other people discussed weather, where you sat at a table, how you were introduced, which pack your grandmother came from. Cressida's grandmother had come from a border settlement so small it did not appear on most maps. She had grown up with mud on her boots and stars overhead, and the particular confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even if no one important has ever heard of you. The moon goddess had heard of her. That was the part no one could forgive. She had been chosen, not selected by committee, not approved after review, but chosen, in the old way, the way the stories described. The mate bond had arrived like weather. Aldrich had felt it first, standing across a crowded ceremonial hall, and the expression on his face had been something Cressida spent a long time trying to interpret and eventually stopped trying. It was not joy, it was not even surprise. It was the face of a man who had made very specific plans and was watching them become irrelevant. He married her. He had no choice. Not if he wanted to keep the goddess's favor, not if he wanted the blessed harvests, and the strong pack bonds, and the golden reputation that made rivals think twice. He married her, and gave her a crown, and placed her beside him at every feast, and introduced her to every visiting dignitary, with the careful politeness of a man who has decided to be professionally civil for the rest of his life. She learned the kingdom. She learned it better than he did, honestly. The names of the border pack elders, the trade disputes that had been running longer than anyone could remember, the villages that needed attention and never quite got it. She visited those villages, quietly, without announcing herself. She sat in small rooms and listened to people talk about their lives, and she remembered everything, and sometimes she was able to help, and that felt like enough. It did not feel like enough on the night of the midwinter solstice feast. The great hall was full. Every alpha lord in the kingdom had come. Every elder, every dignitary, every person whose opinion had weight. The tables were heavy with food, the fires were high, the full moon sat in the open ceiling above them all like a witness. Cressida was standing at Aldrich's side, the way she always stood, straight-backed, composed, wearing the crown that never quite felt like it belonged to her and had long since stopped feeling like it didn't. She was thinking, distantly, about a letter she needed to write to the Western Pack about a water dispute. She was thinking about the cold soup she'd had for dinner, because the kitchen staff always forgot she preferred it warm, and she had never corrected them, because it seemed like a small thing to mind. She was not thinking about what was about to happen. Aldrich stood. The hall went quiet. It always did when he stood. He was that kind of man, the kind whose silence arrived before he did, the kind who could make a room hold its breath without trying. He was, in purely physical terms, exactly what a king was supposed to look like, and he had always known it, and it had not made him better. He spoke clearly. He had rehearsed it. She could tell because there were no pauses in the wrong places, no searching for words. Everything came out smooth and finished, like something that had been shaped over a long period of time into something that could hurt the most, while sounding the most reasonable. He said the mate bond was not sufficient basis for a queenship. He said Astharoon required a Luna of appropriate lineage. He said he had given the matter serious thought and had concluded that the kingdom's future demanded a different choice. He said Seraphine of the Eastern Pack had agreed to stand as his chosen queen. He said all of this without looking at Cressida. That was the part she would remember longest. Not the words, the direction of his eyes. She stood very still. The hall was so quiet she could hear the fires. She was aware of every face turned toward her, some horrified, some fascinated, a few with the careful blankness of people who had known and said nothing. She was aware of Seraphine standing at the edge of the gathering, beautiful and composed, and not quite able to look at her either. She felt something move through her, not grief, not yet, something older and quieter, the particular feeling of a thing being confirmed that you had been trying very hard not to already know. She looked at Aldrich for a long moment. He was still not looking at her. She looked up, through the open ceiling, at the full moon. She did not say anything. She did not cry. She lifted the crown from her head and set it, very carefully, on the table beside her. Then she walked out of the great hall, and every step was unhurried, and the silence behind her was the most complete thing she had ever heard. The cold outside met her like a friend. The first sign came 3 days later. The eastern fields, Seraphine's dowry lands, the richest in the kingdom, the ones that had produced harvests abundant enough to make other lords quietly jealous, went the color of ash before spring had any reason to arrive. Not drought, not frost. The ground simply lost interest. Aldrich's groundskeepers had no explanation. Aldrich's advisors had several, none of which were accurate. Then the pack bonds began to change. It was not something you could see. It was something you felt, or rather, stopped feeling. Wolves who had run together for 20 years, who knew each other the way you know a word you say every day, woke up one morning and found that the thread between them had gone thin and strange. Not gone, just unreliable, like a path that was there and then wasn't, depending on the light. The palace grew uneasy in the way that only places full of proud people can grow uneasy, quietly, around the edges, in conversations that stopped when the wrong person walked in. Then Aldrich's own abilities began to shift. His speed had always been the thing other alphas measured themselves against, and came up short. It did not disappear, it just became ordinary, human-paced, the kind of speed that belongs to a large, fit man, which was impressive to common people, and insufficient to kings. His dominance, the weight of presence that had, for his entire adult life, arrived in rooms before he did, flickered, went inconsistent. There were mornings he woke up and it was there, and mornings he woke up and it was simply not, and there was nothing he could do about either outcome. Seraphine did not say anything about this. But Seraphine had not fallen in love with a man. She had fallen in love with an alpha king. Those are very different things, and she was intelligent enough to know the difference now that the difference was visible. The moon goddess's sacred flame in the capital temple went cold. The priests tried everything. The flame, which had burned without interruption for 400 years, was no longer interested in burning. Elder Marin, who was older than anyone had kept reliable records of, and who had spent her entire life in service of the temple, told the priests to stop trying. She said, to the handful of people who came to her with questions, "The goddess does not punish. She simply withdraws what was never his to begin with." People wrote that down. People thought about it at night. The pack lords who had once sent tribute because the reputation of Astharun made it the obvious and safe thing to do, began to send different kinds of messages. Not hostile exactly, inquiring. The sort of messages you send when you are beginning to wonder whether the arrangement you have been part of still makes sense. Trade routes shifted. Border agreements that had been running on goodwill began to require more formal guarantees that were harder to provide from a kingdom whose foundational strength was visibly, quietly leaving. Aldrich held councils. He made decisions. He was still a capable man, still intelligent, still determined. But there is a difference between a man steering a ship with the wind at his back and the same man steering the same ship in still water. And everyone on the ship can feel it, even when no one says so. He sent people to find Cressida. They came back empty-handed, not because she was hidden, because she was at the northern temple, the old stone sanctuary built into the mountain's face, the one that predated the kingdom itself, and there were wolves there who had come to her on their own, pack members from different territories who had felt something shift and followed it north. They were not an army, they were not a threat, they were simply people who had decided, without being asked, that they knew where they wanted to stand. Aldrich went himself on a morning in early spring. He went alone, which was the first good decision he had made in some time. The road north was long, and it was rough, and his pace was no longer the extraordinary thing it had been. He walked at the speed of a man, which meant he felt the distance the way a man feels it, in his feet, in his legs, in the particular exhaustion that comes from covering ground without any blessing to help you. He slept under trees. He ate what he had packed. He had packed less than he should have, because he was still, in those first days, a man who underestimated difficulty. The fourth day it rained. He sat under a tree that was not quite large enough to shelter him, and thought about Cressida in the western villages, sitting in small rooms, listening to people talk. He had known she did that. He had filed it away as one of those things she occupied herself with, harmless, perhaps even mildly useful. He had not understood what it was. It was leadership. It was the specific and unglamorous kind that does not look like leadership if you are only watching for the version that announces itself. The fifth day he walked and thought about the crown he had taken for granted, and the goddess whose favor he had treated as infrastructure, as background, as something that simply ran, that required no gratitude, because gratitude is for things that might stop. The sixth day he stopped thinking, and just walked. The northern temple came into view on the seventh day, in the late afternoon, when the light was the color of something ending or beginning, depending on how you looked at it. It was made of old stone, and looked like it had grown from the mountain, rather than been built against it. The wolves near the entrance watched him approach without moving. They knew who he was. They let him pass anyway, which told him something about the kind of authority that was being exercised here. Cressida was in the inner courtyard. She was sitting on a low stone bench with her face tilted up toward the late light, and she was not wearing a crown, and she looked more like herself than he had ever seen her look in the palace. She heard him come in. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and did not move toward him, and did not move away. She simply waited. He crossed the courtyard and stood in front of her, and did not know how to begin, and had enough self-awareness, finally, to understand that not knowing how to begin was correct. Some things should not be easy to begin. He sat down on the cold ground in front of her bench, not a dramatic gesture. He was tired, and his legs hurt, and it was the honest thing to do. He said her name. She said, "I'm listening." He told her the truth. Not a shaped version of it. Not the version that distributed fault carefully across multiple parties. Not the version that ended with him looking like someone who had been caught in understandable circumstances. The plain truth. He had been ashamed of her origin, and too proud to examine why. He had wanted a queen who looked like the life he had imagined, and had punished Cressida, quietly, every day, for not being that imaginary person. He had performed cruelty in front of everyone who mattered to her, because he believed the performance would make him feel more powerful. It had not. He said that too. He did not tell her he was sorry, as though sorrow were a transaction, as though saying it were the thing that made everything balance. He simply told her what was true. 7 days of walking had cleaned out most of his defenses, and what was left was small and clear and honest. She listened to all of it. Outside the courtyard walls, the moon was beginning to rise, full and white and enormous, the way it gets in the north, where there is nothing between you and the sky. Cressida looked at him for a long time after he finished speaking. She looked at him the way she had looked at the moon on the night of the feast, not with anger, not with pain, but with the careful attention of someone deciding what is real. She said, "I am not the same person who walked out of that hall." He said, "I know." She said, "You cannot have her back." He said, "I know that too. I'm not asking for her. I don't know what I'm asking for. I think I came because I needed you to know that I understand what I did, and I needed to say it somewhere that wasn't about the kingdom or the goddess, or getting the fields green again. I came because you deserved someone to come." The courtyard was very quiet. The moon was all the way up now, full and present, looking down at the two of them the way it looks at everything, without judgment, without hurry, simply there. Cressida looked at the moon. Then she looked at him. She did not say yes, and she did not say no, and she did not say anything that could be mistaken for a promise. What she did was move slightly on the bench, a small shift, the kind that makes room. He sat beside her. The night came in around them, cold and clear and full of stars, and nothing was settled, and everything was open, and somewhere far to the south, the temple flame, without any priest touching it, quietly came back to life.